Good evening, dreamers. Wherever you are in the world tonight, under city lights, near a quiet sea, or somewhere far inland where the night air smells of wood smoke, I am grateful you've joined me. Before we begin our journey, take a slow, deep breath and let your shoulders soften. If you'd like, tell us softly in the comments where you're listening from. It's comforting to know that even across oceans and time zones, there are others lying quietly now, breathing in rhythm with you. Tonight, we step gently backward, far from screens and streetlights, into the dim hush of the Middle Ages, to a world of frost, firelight, and faith. A world where every breath of warmth was a victory, and survival itself was a kind of grace. It is the 14th century. The land lies still beneath winter's weight. Fields are sleeping, furrows crusted with ice. Beyond the horizon, forests stand black and silent, their branches bowed beneath snow. And on a low, muddy hill, between the cold earth and the iron-gray sky, a single stone castle watches over a scatter of huts. Down in those huts, life flickers faintly but stubbornly. A peasant family gathers close around a hearth that smokes more than it warms. The firewood is nearly gone, so they feed it with reeds, with scraps of old thatch, anything that will catch. The mother stirs a pot of barley and rude stin, but enough to share. The father sharpens his sickle, though there's nothing yet to reap. Their children sleep side by side on straw, wrapped in worn blankets that smell faintly of earth and smoke. Outside, the wind prowls along the thatched roofs. It finds every crack, every space where light escapes, and presses its cold fingers through. But inside, there is still a kind of peace, the rhythm of the fire, the steady sound of breath, the quiet strength of endurance. For Peasant's winter is not simply endured. It is lived through 1 hour at a time. The mornings are dim, the days short, but work never stops. Men walk to the forest edges to gather fallen wood, careful not to trespass into the Lord's hunting ground. Women mend what the year has worn down, tools, clothes, hands, and as daylight fades, bells toll faintly from the manor chapel, a distant reminder of the world above them, where warmth burns in every hearth. When they kneel to pray, they whisper the same Latin words they've heard since childhood, though few understand their meaning. But faith, here, is not about meaning. It is rhythm. It's the same rhythm as sowing, harvesting, sleeping, waking, the pattern of life itself. Outside, the moon spills pale light over the fields. The frozen ground glitters like glass. Somewhere, a lone wolf howls. And in the huts, the youngest child stirs, but does not wake. The mother reaches out, places a hand on their hair, and, toward for a moment, feels whole. In this quiet poverty, there is still a strange dignity. The peasants know the Lord owns their land, their labor, even their seasons. But he cannot own their dreams. In dreams, they walk through green fields again, they hear the bells of spring, they see their children grown. And so, through the long winter night, life continues, fragile, small, and endlessly brave. A candle in a vast, dark, flickering but never quite extinguished. Wherever you are tonight, listening whether in warmth or cold, remember, these small lives once carried the world upon their backs. Their hands turned the soil that fed kings. Their quiet endures built the age we now only whisper about. So close your eyes and imagine the faint glow of that firelight, the scent of smoke, the soft breathing of the sleeping children. This is where our story begins. In the mud and the frost, beneath the watch of the castle on the hill. The peasant's year is only beginning. And so is ours. The frost loosens its grip. It doesn't leave all at once. It hesitates, like an old guest reluctant to go. But then one morning, the peasants wake to dripping roofs and the soft sigh of melting snow. The air smells faintly of wet earth. It's the scent of promise, of work waiting to be done. For the peasants, spring is not just a season, it's deliverance. Winter's hunger has thinned their faces, their stores nearly gone, yet they rise with a kind of quiet gratitude. The earth, at last, is stirring again. They step outside into the pale light. The fields are ragged and gray, the furrows half drowned in melt, but beneath that mess lies hope. Soon, they will sow barley, oats, rye, and beans, the seeds that will decide whether the year is kind or cruel. Tools are brought from corners, their handles smoothed by years of work. The plow, heavy and creaking, is dragged out by the oxen, ribs showing from winter's hunger. The peasants move slowly, methodically. Their lives are measured in rhythm, step, push, turn, breathe, there is a steadiness to it, a kind of prayer in motion. Above them, the castle watches that same grey crown against the sky. The Loris Reeve rides out to count the tenants and mark which strips of land belong to whom. He carries a list who owes how many days of labor, who owes rent and grain, who fell behind last year. The peasants nod respectfully as he passes, though they avoid meeting his eyes. He is not cruel, not always, but he represents power and power. Here is never gentle. But even so, the villagers whisper to each other as they work. They laugh quietly at old jokes, trade gossip, sing under their breath. The thaw brings sound back to the land, the creak of leather, the lowing of oxen, the drip of meltwater into puddles. The world feels alive again. At night, when the sky clears, they sit by the door and watch the stars. No one here knows of galaxies or gravity, but they know those lights are eternal. The same stars have guided plowmen before them, and will guide their children after they're gone. Some believe each star holds a soul. Others say they're the candles of angels. Whatever they are, they shine over every field, rich or poor alike. In the village, there's a small chapel made of stone and wood. Inside, it smells of wax and cold. The priest speaks of resurrection, of how the earth, like their soul, is reborn after death. And the peasants listen, not because they grasp every word, but because the idea feels true. They have seen it themselves year after year. The frozen soil dies and then lives again. So, perhaps, will they, the women, take charge of the gardens. They kneel in the mud, planting herbs, leeks, onions, parsley, and a few medicinal roots that ward off sickness. Children chase chickens, laughing, their boots splashing through puddles. For a brief moment, the world feels forgiving, but the thaw also brings uncertainty. The grain stores are nearly gone, and the new crops won't grow for months. Sometimes, spring hunger bites hardest, the cruelest hunger of all, because salvation is so close, you can smell it in the soil. And yet they endure. They boil nettles into soup, bake bread with ground peas and acorns, stretch every scrap as far as it'll go. Every meal is a small victory, proof that they've survived another day. As evening comes, smoke rises again from the huts, and laughter echoes faintly through the village. Someone plays a fiddle made of old wood and string. The sound drifts up toward the castle walls, where no one listens. But it doesn't matter. The music is for them, for the living, for those who have made it through the dark. And as night falls, the stars return sharper now, mirrored in puddles across the thawing fields. A mother hums softly to her child, tracing circles on their small hand. Outside, an owl calls from the edge of the forest, and the moon, round and gentle, looks down on the peasants in their dreams. The thaw has come, the seeds are ready, and in that quiet space between cold and warmth, life breathes again. Morning mist curls low over the fields, soft as breath. The ground is damp beneath bare feet, smelling of clay and life. The peasants step into the open land, sleeves rolled, tools in hand, ready for the season that defines them. This is when the village truly comes alive. Men, women, and even children move in rhythm, a quiet orchestra of effort. Their wooden plow groans through the earth, pulled by weary oxen whose ribs still show from winter is Celine month. Behind it, the soil turns dark and rich, the scent of it deep and almost sweet. It smells like promise. The seeds come next, small, wrinkled things, carried in linen sacks or wooden bowls. They do not look like much, but in each handful, there's the entire year hope, the food that will fill bellies or leave them hollow come winter. One by one, the peasants walk the furrows, scattering grain with a practiced sweep of the arm. The motion is ancient, older than castles, older than kings. For thousands of years, hands have moved this same way, scattering faith into the earth. A few paces away, children follow, stamping the soil lightly with bare feet to press the seeds in place. Their laughter mingles with the creak of harnesses, the lowing of oxen, and the rhythmic murmur of work songs. The air itself seems to hum with quiet life. High on the hill, the Lord's steward watches. He counts, always counts, how many strips are plowed, how many tenants working, how much land lies fallow. To him, this is arithmetic. To the peasants, it is survival. Yet no one pauses to resent him for long. There is too much to do. Time in the fields is sacred, precious, fleeting. Rain may come too early or too late. The soil may betray them with rot or drought. But for now, the sky is kind. The sun, weak but steady, slips through clouds like pale gold. Around noon, they rest briefly by the hedges. A crust of bread, a piece of cheese, if they're lucky. Someone pours thin ale from a leather flask, and for a moment, there's laughter again. Simple, tired laughter. But laughter all the same. The priest walks by, robes dusty from the road. He blesses the fields with a murmured prayer in Latin. The words, lost on most ears, but carried by the wind. The peasants bow their heads anyway. It can't hurt, they think, to have heaven on your side when you've only got a wooden plow and a sky full of maybes. By evening, their hands ache, their backs burn, but their hearts feel lighter. The land is no longer empty. Each furrow now holds a secret, a promise waiting to rise. When the work is done, they walk home slowly, in silence mostly, boots heavy with mud, shoulders bowed, but with a kind of satisfaction that no coin could buy. They've done what they can. The rest now belongs to the earth. In the village, fires begin to glow. The smell of smoke and stew seeps into the twilight air. Someone plays a pipe. A dog barks. And somewhere, a child asks if the seeds can hear them when they sing, and an old woman smiles and says, yes, of course they can. Night settles like a blanket over the fields. The stars return bright, sharp, the same ancient witnesses to all this quiet labor. The peasants look up before going inside, and perhaps one or two whisper a silent wish for good rain, for health, for mercy. They do not know that centuries later, their world will vanish, that their fields will one day be roads and towns, but tonight, none of that matters. Tonight, they belong to the rhythm of the earth. Sowing, resting, waiting, the endless, gentle pulse of life, continuing in silence. And as the last fire dims, the only sound left is the soft, sleepy wind moving through the plowed fields, a lullaby older than any song. The sun is higher now, and the world is green again. Sprigs of barley and oats push through the soil like shy new thoughts. The peasants rise before dawn, cross themselves at the doorway, and walk the narrow paths between the fields. The same paths their parents once wore into the earth. Each morning smells of dew and smoke, and the low hum of insects fills the air. It would be a perfect peace, if not for the shadow that falls from the hill, the Lord's castle. From the fields below, it looks both magnificent and cruel. Grey stone, glowing faintly in the early light. Banners fluttering in a wind that never seems to reach the village. It is a world apart. The peasants can see it, but they will never touch it. And yet, everything they do, every seed they plant, every loaf they bake, all bends upward, toward that fortress. For this land is not truly theirs. They till it, feed it, love it, but it belongs to the Lord. And so, when his reeve rides down the muddy road again, no one is surprised. He carries a ledger, thick as a brick, and eyes that measure more than they see. He calls each name aloud, his voice cold and clipped, like metal scraping against stone. One by one, the villagers step forward, hats in hands, backs slightly bowed, and tell him what they owe rent in grain, labor for their main fields, the Lord's personal lands. 2 hens for Easter, a share of vanille at meat, and a fine if your fence fell into disrepair, or if your pig wandered where it shouldn't. No one argues. They've learned long ago that resistance is useless, and pride is dangerous. Instead, they nod and promise. Some offer a small smile. Others keep their eyes on the ground. The reeve isn't cruel. Not exactly. He's just a man doing his duty, caught between fear of the peasants' anger and fear of the Lord's. But even a man like him carries weight in this world, and that weight bends backs lower. When the sun reaches its height, he leaves. The village exhales, a single shared breath of relief. But the shadow of power doesn't fade so easily. They know that at harvest, the Lord's men will come again. They will take the first and finest of the grain, load it into wagons, and carry it uphill through the castle gates, where the peasants will never walk. Still, resentment is a dangerous thing. Better to bury it deep, like a stone in the soil, and keep working. So, they do. They tend the crops, mend tools, patch roofs. Children chase each other through tall grass. An old man carves a wooden spoon. Life continues with the same quiet rhythm as before. Sometimes, at dusk, when the castle torches flicker against the sky, the villagers watch from below. They imagine what it might be like inside the warmth, the feasts, the heavy tables of bread and meat. They wonder if the Lord ever looks down and sees them, if he knows the names of those who feed his world. In truth, he rarely does. To him, the village is not a place, but a number. Acres, dues, yields. Yet, once in a while, a rumor spreads that the lord's wife sent food to a poor widow, or that his daughter came down with the priest to give coins to the children, and though no one knows if it's true, they cling to it because hope, even in small doses, makes the burden lighter. As the sky darkens, the castle fades to a silhouette. Only the torches burn now, glowing like distant stars. The peasants watch for a moment, then turn homeward. Their day has been long, their hands blistered, but the fields look good. The crops are rising, and perhaps that is enough to keep going, to hold your place in the great chain, unseen, unthanked, but necessary. In the hush of evening, the wind moves through the wheat like a whisper, as if the earth itself is saying, not forever, but for now. Be midsummer, the fields stand tall and green, the air hums with insects, and the days stretched long and heavy with light. It is the season of labor, the kind that seeps into your bones and leaves your clothes stiff with sweat and dust. But it's also the season of color, sound, and life. The peasants wake before sunrise, the sky still pink and trembling. Their tools gleam faintly in the early light, scythes, sickles, rakes, all sharpened by hand. Every swing, every cut, is measured and sure. The rhythm of it is hypnotic. Swish, pull, gather, bind. The song of the harvesters drifts across the fields like a low chant, steady and soothing. Children help to where they can, stacking sheaves, scaring away birds, bringing water from the stream. Even the elders come to watch, their eyes misty with memory. They've done this all their lives, and though their bodies no longer obey, their hearts still move to the rhythm of the harvest. From the castle, bells toll faintly, not for the peasants, but for the manor's own harvest, happening beyond sight. The peasants pause for a moment, listening, and then return to work. Their fields will not cut themselves. Each evening, when the air cools and the sky turns gold, the village gathers to share a meal. Bread, ale, and onions. Sometimes a rabbit or fish if fortune smiled. The food is simple, but after a day in the sun, it tastes like a feast. Someone brings out a pipe, another a drum. A dance begins awkward at first, then lively. Laughter ripples through the crowd. For a moment, no one thinks about rent or reeves or lords. Just the music, the cool night, the fireflies in the hedges. The church bell marks feast days to the rare breaks from toil. On those mornings, the villagers wash, dress in their best linen, and walk together to the chapel. The air smells of wax and flowers, and sunlight pours through narrow windows like gold dust. The priest's voice echoes softly. Pax vobiscum, peace be with you. Afterward, the villagers gather outside, talking, laughing, trading small gifts or gossip. There is always food, always ale, and sometimes even a traveling peddler with trinkets from distant towns, bright cloth, combs, or a bit of salt. For a few hours, the weight of life feels lighter, but labor is never far. Even in laughter, they know that soon the fields will call again. There are weeds to pull, fences to mend, roofs to thatch before autumn's rain. Still, there's pride in it. Honest, quiet pride. To see the fruits of their own hands ripen beneath the sun. To watch the land repay their toil, even briefly. The peasants don't have words like dignity or purpose, but they live them all the same. They belong to the earth, and the earth, for now, seems to remember them kindly. At night, when the moon rises over the meadows, the fields glow faintly, silver ripples under a soft sky. A boy looks up from his bundle of hay and whispers to his sister, "Do you think the Lord sees the same moon we do?" And she smiles sleepily and says, "Yes, but it shines brighter here." In the stillness that follows, even the owls seem to pause. The air smells of hay, smoke, and something sweet. The scent of summer's peak, the moment before it turns. For tomorrow, the rhythm will continue. Swing, gather, bind, rest, repeat. But tonight, there is music, and laughter, and life. The world is whole, if only for a breath. The fields are golden now, the soft shimmer of ripened grain under the sun. From a distance, the village looks blessed, almost rich. But those who live here know better. This beauty is fleeting, and soon it must be measured, divided, and carried away. Harvest time is not just the season of plenty, it's also the season of reckoning. Every stalk cut is counted, every sheaf noted, every basket weighed. The Lord's men ride down from the castle, their horses stepping carefully between rows, hooves crushing bits of straw. They do not come to help. They come to collect. First comes the tithe. The churches do 1/10 of everything the land has yielded, gathered for God, though it often ends up feeding the priest in the abbey instead. The peasants line up outside the small stone church, carrying sacks of grain, baskets of beans, and the occasional hen. The priest blesses them, his voice calm and formal. Dominas det, vobascopio. May the Lord give you abundance. Some bow their heads, others stare blankly ahead, thinking of the food they will no longer have. Then comes the tax, the Lord's share. It's heavier, more demanding, more exacting. The reeve and the bailiff count carefully, writing down figures on parchment. The peasants stand by, silent, as their hard-earned harvest is loaded into carts bound for the manor storehouse. For the Lord, this is his right. For the peasants, it is the price of survival. No one dares speak of unfairness aloud, though the thought flickers behind tired eyes. They've seen what happens to those who do a fine, a beating, or worse. And besides, the law of the land is older than memory. It feels as immovable as the sky itself. By afternoon, the carts rumble up the hill, leaving the villagers with what remains enough, perhaps, to last the winter if they are careful. If the weather holds, if no one falls sick, if the rats stay away. But if is a dangerous word in a peasant's world. That night, they sit by their fires, eating a thin stew made from what's left. It tastes faintly of smoke and resignation. Yet, around the hearth, someone begins to hum an old song, slow, wordless, more feeling than melody. One by one, the others join in, until the whole hut hums softly like a single voice. It's not defiance. It's endurance made into music. A child asks why the Lord takes so much when they work so hard. The mother hesitates before answering. Because the world was made that way, she says gently. But remember, no Lord can own the wind, or the stars, or what you dream. Outside, the night is full of movement. Mice scurry in the straw, and the moon floats high and indifferent. In the distance, the castle lights flicker, torches glowing behind thick walls. The peasants know those walls are built from their labor, stone by stone, grain by grain. But they also know the castle cannot grow food, cannot birth children, cannot sing by the fire. It is the peasants who give the world its pulse. By the time dawn comes, the carts are gone, and the field stands silent once more. Stripped, but still golden, in the early light. There's sadness, yes, but also something unspoken. Pride, for even after everything taken, the land still gives. And tomorrow, they will begin again. The mornings after harvest are quiet, a hush that feels both heavy and relieved. But soon, the rhythm returns. The carts roll, the gates open, and the path to the market fills again with footsteps, creaking wheels, and the low hum of trade. The medieval market was more than a place to sell. It was the village's beating heart. Even for peasants who had little to spare, it was a brief window into a larger world. People came from miles away, bringing not just goods, but stories. A shepherd from the hills with wool to sell. A potter from the next town with glazed bowls that caught the sun. A woman with honey, thick and golden, poured from clay jars. Children trailed behind, clutching their mother's skirts, wide-eyed at the noise and color. Coins changed hands, though few had many. More often, trade was barter. A measure of grain for a length of thread, a candle for a wedge of cheese. Everything had value, but nothing came easy. Even laughter here was careful, tinged with awareness of who was listening. Yet, for one morning each week, the air smelled of possibility. News arrived to a wedding in the next shire, a rumor of soldiers passing, a tale of a saint's relic found far to the south. The peasants listened, eyes half closed, carried away by the voices. It was the only travel most of them would ever know, through the words of others. And above it all, the church bells rang, deep, slow tones rolling across the rooftops, calling all to remember the divine order of things. Market and mass were not rivals, they were intertwined. You bought, you sold, and then you prayed. Because all gain was seen as temporary, all loss as a test. Inside the church, the cool air smelled of incense and stone. Light slipped through colored glass, spilling red and blue over the rough benches. A few peasants knelt, whispering prayers for rain, for mercy, for a little more bread this winter. The priest's Latin washed over them, words most couldn't understand but had heard all their lives. The rhythm itself was comfort enough. There was beauty here, in the sound, in the color, in the certainty that something larger existed, even if distant. The peasants did not question much, though in the quiet corners of their minds, so may wonder it. If God made all men, why did he place some in castles and others in mud? The question drifted like smoke, fragile, half-formed, and quickly gone. After the Mass, life continued. A boy carried home a bundle of salt wrapped in cloth. A mother tucked a candle into her sleeve for the dark nights to come. The market emptied, leaving behind the faint smell of earth and animals, and the echo of footsteps fading toward the fields. By afternoon, the churchyard filled with softer sounds, women talking as they scrubbed linen at the well, the creak of the wheel drawing water, the clatter of book. Even this was a kind of rhythm work, wrapped around faith, duty tied to survival. And when the sun dipped low, painting the sky in pale golden ash, the village exhaled. Children played with bits of straw. Men mended tools by fading light. The priest locked the church door, its bell now silent until dawn. The market, the church, the field. 3 points of a triangle that shaped a peasant's life. Together, they made a world both narrow and infinite, small enough to walk across in a morning, yet vast enough to hold centuries of endurance. And as night descended once more, the sound of quiet prayer and faraway laughter blended with the whisper of the wind through the thatch, the timeless voice of a world that refused to vanish. The first sign of winter was not snow. It was silence. The birds grew fewer, the mornings lost their color, and the air took on that dry, sharp stillness that seemed to watch you breathe. For peasants, winter was not a season, it was a test. Every year, it asked the same question: did you store enough? If the answer was yes, there might be songs by the fire. If not, there would be hunger, and the kind of quiet that feels heavier than stone. The fields that once shimmered with green now lay bare, pale stubble sticking out of frozen mud. The plows were dragged back to the barns, their blades dull, resting like tired beasts. Men mended them slowly, not because there was much to do, but because it kept the hands warm. Outside, frost traced white fingers across the thatch, creeping in through cracks, dusting everything in a shimmer that looked almost beautiful, if you didn't know what it meant. Inside the cottages, the fire became the sun. Families gathered close, so close that the smoke and warmth became one thing. Every breath tasted of wood and ash. Children huddled under rough wool blankets, listening to their mothers tell stories, not of princes or knights, but of old winters, when people survived by sharing everything they had. Sometimes, the wind howled like something alive, clawing at the shutters. And in that sound, peasants heard more than whether they heard memory, of wolves once roaming the forests, of spirits said to wander hungry through the snow. Old fears never really left the countryside. They just changed shape with each generation. Yet there was comfort in routine. Each morning began the same. The father blowing life into a dying ember. The mother stirring the pot of thin pottage, steam rising like a ghost. Sometimes, a loaf of bread baked weeks ago was softened in broth. It might crumble, but it fed everyone. They stretched food the way they stretched hope with quiet, practiced skill. On better days, there might be a little salt pork or cheese. On worse ones, dry peas, or nothing but patience. And always, the cold pressed closer. The Lord's Manor, of course, still burned bright. A few men were sent there to carry wood or bring grain to the storehouse, watching, wordless, as the hall's fires roared and hounds lay fat on the floor. The peasants would bow and leave quickly. It wasn't envy that filled their chests, just a kind of tired acceptance. The world was uneven, and winter only made that clearer. Still, life did not stop. The women spun flax by lamplight. The men carved handles, mended tools, shaped small things from leftover wood. Spoons, bowls, toys. These were gifts of necessity, but also of care. Something made by hand could warm a heart when the worlds outside froze solid. And then came the feasts, or what passed for them. Christmas in a peasant's house was humble but sacred. They would bake a better loaf, if they could, light every candle they owned, and sing softly by the hearth. The priest's voice would carry across the village: peace on earth, goodwill to men. And for one night, even hunger felt a little less sharp. But as January came, the larders grew thin. The woodpile shrank. You could hear the sound of axes deep in the forest, that echo of survival ringing between the trees. Every log carried home was another day's life, bought against the cold. Sometimes, in the late night, a family might hear the soft cry of an animal caught in the snow, and a man would rise, lantern in hand, and go out to sea. It wasn't just about pity or food, it was about staying human, even when the world seemed to forget kindness. Winter tested everything: the body, the spirit, the bonds between people. And when spring finally came, it didn't feel like a change in season. It felt like resurrection, because those who endured it didn't just live. They earned their place in the turning of time. The peasants knew this truth in their bones. The land gives, the land takes, and the only way through it all is together. When the thaw finally came, it did not announce itself with trumpets. It came in drips, water sliding down the eaves, tiny rivers forming in the dirt, the quiet sigh of the world loosening its frozen grip. But with the first soft earth came something else, the return of rule. Winter belonged to survival. Spring belonged once more to the Lord. As the roads cleared, the bailiff rode again, counting, checking, reminding everyone who the land truly belonged to. Every field was a ledger, every furrow a debt to be measured. For peasants, spring was not just about planting, it was about proving they still owed everything. The village green filled with murmurs when the steward arrived. He wore fur-lined sleeves, his boots clean even in the mud, his tone slow and deliberate. By order of his lordship, he'd begin as if the sentence itself carried the weight of the heavens. He would speak of dues unpaid, of boundaries blurred, of the Lord's forest being taken, even if all someone had done was gather fallen wood to keep their child warm. And yet, despite the imbalance, the peasants bowed, not because they believed it was fair, but because the alternative was ruin. To be fined was hardship. To be punished was danger. To resist was death in disguise. Still, there were quiet rebellions, a rabbit trapped in secret, a bundle of grain hidden beneath straw, a muttered word when no one important was near. These small acts were the peasant's version of freedom, invisible but alive. Sometimes, the Lord himself would appear, riding through the fields. His cloak shimmered with embroidered lions, his horse tall enough to look down upon the roofs. The peasants would remove their caps and lower their eyes, though a few dared to glance up to see if the man who ruled their lives had a face of mercy or indifference. Often, it was neither. It was simply distant. To the Lord, they were part of the soil, as expected as the rain. Justice, when it came, was uneven. A man who stole a loaf might lose a hand. A noble who took a peasant's daughter might lose only a night's sleep. The church taught patience, the Lord demanded obedience, and between those two pillars, the common folk built their quiet endurance. But hope, somehow, still lived. Not the loud kind, not the kind that topples walls, but the kind that hums under the breath, that glows faintly in the dark. It was found in laughter by the hearth, in weddings held beneath wildflowers, in babies swaddled tight and blessed with trembling hands. Every new birth was a declaration. The world can be cruel, but we will not vanish. And sometimes, even the Lord's court became a strange theater of humanity. Once, it was said, an old peasant woman appeared before the steward, accused of taking eggs from the Lord's hens. When asked if she denied it, she said, "I took what the wind left in my path." The steward frowned, unsure whether to laugh or to punish. In the end, he fined her one egg, not for theft, but for wit. The village remembered that for years because stories were the peasants' armor. When the world refused justice, they found meaning in the retelling. Each tale passed around the fire was a thread of resistance, a way to remind themselves that, though the Lord owned their land, he did not own their imagination. And in that imagination, they dreamed not of castles or crowns, but of a gentler world. One where no one went hungry, where the church bells rang for all alike, but even the poorest could walk without fear. Dreams like that were dangerous, but they were also necessary, because without them, the peasants might forget they were human at all. So they held on not to the law, but to each other. When someone fell sick, others brought broth. When a roof collapsed, men gathered to rebuild it. When the steward turned his back, laughter returned to the air. The Lord ruled the land, yes, but the people ruled its soul. And that quiet defiance, unrecorded in any chronicle, was perhaps the truest kind of power the medieval world ever knew. By the time summer returned, the land itself seemed to breathe again. The fields, which had once lain silent under frost, now shimmered with waves of green. Each stalk of barley, each tender ear of wheat, was a promise whispered to the sky that hunger would not win this year. For the peasants, harvest was both a celebration and a sentence. It meant long days, aching arms, and backs bent from dawn until the last streak of gold faded beyond the trees. But it also meant fullness baskets heavy, barns filling, the faint comfort of knowing there might be enough to see the winter through. The rhythm of the sickles was steady, almost musical. Swish, crackle, gather. The sound rolled across the fields like a lullaby of labor. Men cut, women bound, children followed behind, stacking and singing in low, rhythmic tones, songs older than memory, sung not to pass time but to make it bearable. The Lord's men stood nearby, counting what was owed. A share for the manor, a share for the church, a smaller share for the ones who had done the work. And yet, there was no bitterness in their movements, at least not openly. The peasants understood the pattern. Unfair, yes, but familiar. And there was comfort in the familiar. Still, the harvest brought small freedoms. On the last evening of cutting, the village would hold its feast, the harvest home. It began with gratitude, quiet at first, heads bowed, hands clasped, the priest's voice drifting over the gathered crowd. Then, when the prayers were done, the stillness broke into laughter. Someone brought out an old lute, another struck rhythm on a wooden cup. They danced, not as nobles did in halls, but in a way that made the earth itself seem to join them, bare feet on cool soil, skirts swirling, the air full of warmth and smoke. There was a superstition, passed through generations, that the last sheaf of wheat held the spirit of the field. So they treated it with reverence, tied it with ribbon, placed it on the altar, or hung it above a door. It was both a charm and a prayer, a way of saying thank you to the land that had spared them once again. And amidst the music and laughter, small things happened that were almost sacred in their simplicity. Two young people would sneak away from the firelight to talk beneath the trees. An old man would tell stories of harvesters long past, his eyes bright with both memory and disbelief that he was still here. A widow would smile, perhaps for the first time since spring. Hope came quietly in those moments, not as a grand revelation, but as warmth that seeped into the bones. Ibn Taylor, watching from his distant manor, could not truly own this. He could take a share of their grain, their labor, Ibn Tercoin, but he could not touch the joy that bloomed in the hearts of those who had survived another cycle. That joy belonged to them alone. As the night deepened, the village fires burned lower. Children fell asleep in their mothers' arms. The stars returned, steady and ancient, just as they had for all the harvests that came before. Somewhere, an owl called from the forest, and the sound seemed less like warning and more like a blessing. And so the peasants rested, bodies sore but souls strangely light. They had worked, endured, and gathered what they could from the earth. Not just food, but meaning. Because in their quiet world, the act of survival was not only necessity, it was art. It was faith. It was proof that, though forgotten by the chronicles of kings, they were part of something vast and unbreakable, the endless heartbeat of the land itself. Change, when it comes to the countryside, does not arrive with fanfare. It trickles in like distant thunder heard, long before it's felt. And in one quiet summer, after the harvest songs had faded, the peasants began to sense that something in the air had shifted. Rumors first came down the road like stray leaves. A new king, a war brewing far away, taxes rising again to feed the hunger of armies. Most villagers didn't know the names of kings. They lived and died under the same old oaths. But when soldiers began to march through nearby towns, the stories no longer felt like distant dreams. The Lord, once content to hunt and feast, now wore a sterner look. He rode with more men. The steward's voice turned colder when he spoke of dues. The priest, too, began to preach more about obedience, sin, and sacrifice. And though the peasants nodded in church, in the fields they whispered, "If the great men are uneasy, what will become of us?" They didn't fear kings. Kings were myths. They feared disruption, because disruption was hunger, and hunger was the oldest enemy of all. Soon, the Lord's messengers came with parchment and seal, declaring that every able man must serve or pay in grain what his labor was worth. The village gathered to listen as the decree was read aloud, each word heavy as a stone. No one protested. They just stared at one another, as if trying to remember which of them could be spared and which could not. War meant more than fighting. It meant fewer hands in the field, fewer tools repaired, fewer songs at dusk. It meant mothers waiting, not for news, but for silence. Still, life went on. It had to. Children chased chickens, women baked, old men sat at the well, watching clouds drift over land they would never leave. Even when the shadow of power reached them, the rhythm of ordinary things held its quiet defiance. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the sun hung low and the sky turned to honeyed fire, the peasants would stop working just to watch. The light on the Lord's tower would gleam red, beautiful and a little cruel. That tower, to them, was more than stone. It was a reminder that somewhere above their lives, decisions were made by people who would never bend their backs to the soil. And yet, those same lords depended on the people below, utterly. For every sword raised in battle, 100 hands had sown the grain that fed it. The peasants understood this truth instinctively, though few dared to say it aloud. They were the hidden strength of kingdoms invisible until the world began to tremble. Sometimes, that tremor was closer than they thought. In the market they began to hear of villages burned in raids, of taxes doubled overnight, of men dragged away by passing soldiers. The fear spread slowly, like frost creeping across the edge of a winter. But fear has a strange way of sharpening the will to live. The peasants did what they had always done, adapted. They dug root cellars deeper. They hid small sacks of grain beneath floorboards. They saved seed, prayed harder, and trusted the old earth more than any man in armor. At night, the wind would carry the faint echo of distant drums, the sound of the great world turning. And in the dark, a mother would hold her child a little tighter, whispering, "Sleep now. Whatever storms may come, the land still breathes beneath us." Because even when crowns clashed and banners burned, the soil remained, and those who worked at the invisible millions held the quiet power of survival. No decree, no war, no king could take that away. The war passed by the village like a storm that grazes the edge of a field. It did not strike them directly, not at first, but its winds were felt all the same. The roads grew emptier. The merchants stopped coming, and the sound of distant hoofbeats no longer meant travelers, but soldiers. The first sign of change was the quiet. A kind of hollow stillness settled over the countryside. The bells in the church tower rang less often. The steward's messengers came no more. Ebentelord's banner, which once waved proudly above the manor, hung limp and faded. It was said that the king's men had clashed with rebels in a valley not far away. No one in the village had seen it, but they felt it in the price of bread, in the absence of fathers, in the unease that crept through conversations. When news finally arrived, it came not from heralds, but from refugees. Hollow-eyed men and women walking barefoot along the dirt road, their clothes torn, their faces gray with dust and disbelief. They spoke of fire, of villages burned to ash, of crops trampled under horses' hooves. The peasants listened in silence. Some offered bread, others just nodded and turned away, as if to do anything else might invite the same fate upon themselves. For a while, the Lord's manor seemed abandoned, its gates closed, its windows dark. No one knew whether the Lord had gone to war or fled it. In his absence, the village lived in a strange, fragile freedom. There were no taxes collected, no orders barked, only the steady rhythm of need, to eat, to mend, to endure. But freedom, for the poor, was never without fear. They were alone now. No law to protect, no authority to punish. And when power vanishes, other kinds of danger grow quickly in the dark. Bands of desperate men began to wander, soldiers without pay, thieves without names. The peasants learned to hide what little they had. At the sound of hooves, the children ran inside, and the men stood still, pretending they owned nothing worth taking. One night, a small band came, rough men, in tattered armor, faces hidden by grime. They demanded food and shelter, claiming to fight for a cause no one in the village had heard of. The peasants gave them bread and ale, not out of kindness, but to make them leave faster. When Don Came, they were gone, and so were 2 hens, a hug of meal, and the last of the candles. But the village endured. Eat, always, death. When the great world tore itself apart, they simply waited for the pieces to fall back into place. Then, one afternoon, a rider appeared, a messenger from the manor. The war, he said, was ending. The king had won. The taxes would resume. The people listened, their faces unreadable. To them, one king or another mattered little. The land was still here. The seasons still turned, and they still had to work. Yet, there was something different now. Not rebellion, not relief, but understanding. They had seen the Lord's power vanish like smoke, seen soldiers crumble into hunger, seen the so-called mighty become as desperate as peasants. And from that sight came a quiet strength. That night, when the fires burned low and the crickets sang again, a sense of calm settled over the village. Not peace, exactly, but balance restored. The men sharpened their tools once more. The women baked with the last of the flour. The children chased fireflies under a forgiving sky. The silence after battle is not just the absence of war. It is the earth remembering how to breathe. And as the wind moved softly through the thatched roofs, the peasants slept dreamless, exhausted, but alive, because survival itself had become their victory. The war had passed, but peace was never simple. In the years that followed, the village learned once more to listen to its own heartbeat. The creak of the well rope, the toll of the bell, the rustle of grain in the wind, but beneath that steady rhythm, another pulse began to grow. The pulse of belief. For peasants, faith was both comfort and compass. It told them why they suffered, and why they must endure. It explained what they could not control: the storms, the sickness, the death of a child, the silence of winter. It gave shape to mystery, even when the answers were too heavy to bear. Each Sunday, they filled the small stone church, crowding under its vaulted beams, their breath rising in the cold air like smoke. The priest's Latin rolled through the room, melodic and strange, as the sunlight filtered through stained glass. Most didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone, part warning, part lullaby. They knelt, they crossed themselves, they whispered prayers for rain, or mercy, or forgiveness. And when they left, they felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because they had survived another week. Yet faith in the Middle Ages was not gentle. It was edged with fear. People believed that every sickness, every poor harvest, every strange noise in the woods might be a sign punishment, perhaps, or a spirit unsettled. The priest spoke of heaven, but also of hell, the fire that never died, the torment that awaited the sinful. And so, even as they prayed for salvation, they also prayed to be spared from God's anger. Still, there was beauty in it, in the candles flickering against old stone, in the hymns sung through cracked voices, in the way a mother would trace a cross over her child's brow before bed. Faith was woven into every moment. They sowed in God's name. They harvested in God's name. They even buried their dead in His earth, trusting that the same soil that took would someday give back. But there was another kind of faith too, older, quieter, hidden beneath the Christian prayers. It lived in the herbs. Women hung over their doors, in the whispers spoken to the moon, in the way they thanked the first blossom of spring. It wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance. Echoes of a time when the world itself was sacred, before churches stood where oak groves once did. The priest disapproved. Of course, he called it superstition, the work of ignorance. But he never truly stopped it. Perhaps he knew that for people who had so little, every bit of hope, whether blessed or forbidden, mattered. On cold nights, when the wind howled and the sky was black, the villagers would light small fires in the fields. They said it kept away spirits. Maybe it did, but it also did something more. It gave them a reason to gather, to speak softly of those who had gone before. The flames flickered on, faces worn by labor and laughter, and for a few moments, faith felt like a shared warmth, fragile, human, and real. And when the church bell finally tolled for the last time that night, calling them back to their beds, they would glance once more at the stars. Somewhere above, they believed, angels watched, but perhaps, too, the old gods listened still, patient as ever. Faith and fire, both dangerous, both beautiful, burned quietly in the hearts of peasants who had nothing else to own. And maybe that was why, despite all hardship, they never lost their will to endure. Because to believe, in any form, was to resist despair. And so the year turned again, as it always did, soft and steady, like the turning of a great unseen wheel. The peasants had survived another cycle, one of hunger and hope, of frost and firelight, of laughter that somehow managed to echo, even in the coldest months. When the first light of spring spilled across the thatched roofs, it was more than sunlight, it was renewal. The earth thawed, softening under their feet, and the frozen fields once again smelled of soil and promise. They began their work anew, their fingers pressing seed into the wet ground, each seed a prayer, each furrow a quiet act of faith in tomorrow. They knew by now that nothing was certain, that rain might drown their crops, or drought might starve them. But they planted anyway. It was what humans had always done, sowing in hope, even when the world gave them every reason not to, because to till the soil was not just survival, it was trust. The children ran through the meadows barefoot, chasing bees, laughing into the wind. The elders sat near the fire, mending tools, sharing stories of years so far past they had begun to feel like legend. And in the middle of it all, the world simply breathed, green, gentle, alive again. Summer followed, golden and full. It was the time of long days and short tempers, of sweat running down sunburned necks, of laughter during the hay harvest, when everyone, men, women, and children, joined hands to gather what the fields had given. At night, they lay in the open air, staring up at stars so sharp they looked almost close enough to touch. Sometimes, in that silence, they forgot for a moment that they were peasants, or poor, or bound by anyone's rule. For those few hours, under the wide summer sky, they were simply human, warm, breathing, alive. Autumn came, bringing its deep smell of smoke and soil. They stored what they could: grains, onions, salted meat. They gave thanks for what they'd been allowed to keep. And then came the harvest feast. A rare night of joy. The Lord's men might take their due, but tonight the villagers sang. There was bread, ale, roasted goose, and music that carried far across the fields. Even the oldest joined in, their tired faces glowing in the candlelight. It wasn't wealth that made them rich. It was this: the closeness, the belonging, the small flickering joy that refused to die. Then winter returned. Not cruel this time, but familiar. The smoke from each chimney rose slow and blue into the gray air. Inside, the cottages were dim and warm, filled with the crackle of firewood and the sound of quiet voices. There was less food now, but enough. There was cold, but also comfort. The comfort of having endured before and knowing they would endure again. Outside, frost painted the trees silver. The world seemed asleep, but beneath the frozen earth, life waited patient, invisible, ready to rise again when the sun returned. And in that long silence between the years, the peasants rested, not in peace exactly, but in something close, a stillness that only those who have labored, suffered, and yet survived can ever truly feel. The kind of stillness that hums softly with gratitude. The mud and the crown, the peasant and the Lord, their fates were bound, year after year, by the same turny earth. The Lord's castle might crumble one day, his name forgotten in dust, but the rhythm of the fields, the heartbeat of the people, would go on. It always did. So, dreamer, wherever you are in the world tonight, perhaps your life, too, has its own quiet seasons, its winters of waiting, its springs of hope. Maybe you, too, rise each day and sow your small seeds of faith, of work, of love, and maybe that is the truest story of all, that through time, through kingdoms and ruins, through the turning of every year, humanity endures. Sleep gently now, under the same stars that watched those peasants centuries ago. Their world is gone, but their rhythm still lives on, in the beating of your own quiet, steadfast heart.